The winter wind sliced through the crowded parking lot of the Norfolk Veterans Center, carrying with it the salt-heavy scent of the nearby harbor and the low murmur of 1,000 conversations. It was the annual Veterans Day Gala, a night of polished brass, rustling gowns, and the clinking of medals against crisp dress uniforms. Among the sea of attendees, a woman named Elara Vance moved with an almost magnetic confidence. She wore the uniform of a Navy Chief Petty Officer with a precision that seemed immaculate, the fabric hugging her frame as if it had been tailored specifically for this single night. Pinned to her chest was a formidable rack of ribbons, but one decoration in particular caught the ambient light and held it hostage: the gold and blue of a silver star, the nation's third highest award for valor in combat. Elara navigated the crowd with the practiced ease of a seasoned socialite, her posture ramrod straight. She spoke in a low, modulated tone to a circle of young officers, her hands gesturing subtly as she described a harrowing firefight in the dusty alleyways of Ramadi. She spoke of splitting up a unit, of calling in danger-close air support, of the specific, gut-wrenching sound of a bullet passing near one's ear. The young men listened, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and professional envy. To them, she was living history, a direct link to the legendary prowess of the naval special warfare community. "Chief Vance, is it?" a Jongnean man in a Navy blazer asked, extending his hand. "The detail on your story about the Chaoliang in Nasiriyah was incredible. I read the after-action report years ago, and you painted an even clearer picture." Elara took his hand with a firm, brief shake, her eyes holding a practiced look of humble recognition. "It's not something you ever forget, sir. The brotherhood you build in those moments, it's thicker than blood." Her voice carried a slight rasp, the kind often associated with years of shouting over helicopter rotors or pulling a struggling swimmer from the surf. She seamlessly integrated herself into the fabric of the event, a chameleon so skilled that she appeared to be the very pattern it was woven from. The evening wore on, filled with speeches and dedications. Elara stood towards the back during the keynote, her hand over her heart during the national anthem, her lips moving silently to the words. To any observer, she was the picture of a dedicated, combat-worn veteran. But perception, and as it often does, began to fray at the edges under closer scrutiny. A retired Master Chief, a man named Kowalski, whose face was a roadmap of decades of service, had been watching her from across the room. He wasn't captivated by her stories. He was studying her. He saw the way she held her champagne flute, the way she shifted her weight when she spoke for too long. It wasn't anything blatant, just a series of Wei Xiao notes that played a discordant tune in his memory. He leaned over to a younger, active-duty lieutenant commander. "Who's the chief with the silver star? From Dam Neck?" The lieutenant commander shrugged. "Never seen her before. Says she's with DevGru support, out of the picture for a while on special assignment." Kowalski grunted, his eyes never leaving Elara. "DevGru support doesn't talk about DevGru support. Especially not to a crowd of strangers in a banquet hall." It was the first silent note of suspicion, a whisper of doubt that would soon grow into a roar. For Elara, the night was just another successful performance, another room conquered. She had no idea that the final curtain was already beginning its slow, inevitable descent. The atmosphere in the Norfolk Federal Courthouse was a stark contrast to the gala's glitter. The air was sterile, smelling of floor polish and stale anxiety. Elara Vance stood in an interrogation room, the fluorescent lights above humming a monotonous, accusatory tone. The door was heavy steel, painted a dull gray, and it separated her from the freedom of the persona she had so carefully constructed. Across the metal table sat two special agents from the NCIS, their faces impassive, their eyes holding the flat, the patient stare of men who had all the time in the world. Chief Vance, Agent Miller began, his voice devoid of any inflection. For the record, you are not under arrest. You're here voluntarily to help us clear up some discrepancies regarding your service record. You understand your rights? Ilara leaned back in her chair, affecting an air of weary confusion. I understand that I'm being treated like a criminal for serving my country. My lawyer should be here. She was good. Her indignation seemed genuine, fueled by the righteousness of the wronged. Your lawyer has been notified, Agent Miller continued, sliding a thin folder across the table. While we wait, maybe you can help us understand a few things. Your file here, he tapped the folder, states you were a special warfare operator, a SEAL, attached to a support element for the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. It says you were in Ramadi in 2006, Nasiriyah in 2008, and that you were awarded the Silver Star for actions during an ambush that extracted a downed pilot. Ilara nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the folder as if it contained a piece of her very soul. That's right. It's not something I like to talk about, but the details are in there. Agent Diaz, the other agent, spoke for the first time. His voice was softer, more conversational. The problem, Chief, is that the details aren't in there. Not really. See, we pulled the personnel rosters from every team in 2006 and 2008. We pulled unit diaries, deployment logs, and flight manifests from every CSAR mission in those theaters. He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. Your name isn't on any of them. And not one. A flicker of something, panic, maybe, or a lightning-fast calculation darted across Ilara's face before she mastered it. She scoffed. Of course it isn't. I already told your colleague I was attached to a DevGru support element. Those are black ops. You think they put that stuff in some public database for anyone to pull? My entire record is buried in a SCIF in Virginia Beach. You need a higher clearance than you've got to see it. The agents exchanged the slightest of glances. This was the wall they always hit with these cases, the impenetrable, convenient shield of classified operations. It was a clever tactic, one that had worked for her for years. It created a fog of doubt, a plausible deniability that made prosecutors hesitant. Before they could continue, the heavy door clicked open. A man in a perfectly tailored Navy service dress blue uniform walked in. He wasn't young, but he carried his age with an authority that filled the room more effectively than any shout could. On his collar were the silver stars of a rear admiral. He was accompanied by a Zhongnian woman in a severe pantsuit, who introduced herself as Ilara's appointed counsel, a public defender named Sarah Jenkins. The admiral didn't sit. He stood by the door, his gaze fixed on Ilara with an unnerving intensity. Agent Miller stood. Admiral, I know what you were just doing, Agent, the Admiral said, his voice a low rumble. His eyes remained locked on Ilara. I read the file. I saw the name of the unit she claims to have supported. I served 2 tours with that command. He took a step closer to the table. Chief Vance, can you describe the layout of the main operations building on the compound? Ilara's mind raced. She had studied. She had read memoirs, pored over declassified documents, and watched every documentary ever made. Of course, sir. 2-story structure. The TOC is on the 2nd floor, west side. Armory in the basement. The Chow Hall is a separate building to the north. The Admiral's expression didn't change. What's the name of the Chui Shiyuan who ran the Chow Hall in 2008? This was a trap, a specific granular detail no memoir would contain. Ilara's confidence wavered. I don't remember, sir. We just called him Gunny. Wrong, the Admiral stated flatly. There was no Chow Hall. We ate MREs for 3 months straight while that building was being renovated. You'd know that if you'd been there. He turned to Agent Miller. Book her. Be charges of impersonating a naval officer, theft of valor, and fraud against the United States. As Agent Miller stood to place Ilara in handcuffs, Something on her chest caught the Admiral's eye. It was the silver star, still pinned there from the gala, which she had worn to the interrogation, hoping it would lend her an air of credibility. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a murmur meant only for her ears, yet it carried with such clarity that it seemed to echo in the small room. "That medal, the specific engraving on the reverse, the way the ribbon is aged. Only Special Forces have that particular variant from that year's mint. It's a flawless forgery. Where did you get it?" He didn't wait for an answer. He simply turned and walked out, leaving the words hanging in the sterile air. The murmur was not an accusation of her lie, but a confirmation of a deeper, more disturbing truth. Her deception was so sophisticated, so intimately detailed, that it had crossed a line from simple fraud into something that genuinely puzzled the very people she sought to imitate. For the first time, the question wasn't just, who is she lying, but who is she really to have access to this? The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the spotlight she had so desperately sought. The days that followed Ilara's arrest were a media whirlwind. The story, with its tantalizing mix of valor, deception, and a mysterious military secret, was irresistible. She was labeled a classic, stolen valor case, a woman with a pathological need for attention who had woven a fantasy so detailed she had apparently begun to believe it herself. But inside the sterile confines of the Norfolk Detention Center, a different, far more complex narrative was beginning to unfold. Ilara's initial bravado had crumbled into a stony silence. She refused to speak to the media, refused to give interviews, and offered her court-appointed lawyer, Sarah Jenkins, little more than clipped, one-word answers. Sarah was frustrated. The prosecution was building an airtight case. They had veterans ready to testify, including Master Chief Kowalski, who would explain the subtle behavioral tells that marked her as an imposter. They had records experts who would deconstruct her fabricated service history. The Silver Star alone, an expert had confirmed, was a forgery of such high quality that it suggested professional counterfeiting, not something made in a basement workshop. The evidence was damning, and the public sentiment was overwhelmingly against her. The court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict: guilty. Yet, Rear Admiral Hollis, the man whose murmur had sealed her fate, couldn't let the case go. He sat in his office at the Pentagon, the single piece of evidence that troubled him most, laid out under a magnifying lamp: the Silver Star. He had been in the special operations community for over 30 years. He knew its secrets, its heroes, and its ghosts. And he knew that the specific, almost imperceptible details on this medal, the exact die strike of the star, the particular shade of the ribbon's blue, the way the suspension brooch was aged, weren't just the work of a skilled forger. They were perfect, too perfect. It was as if someone had used an actual issued medal from a specific, classified time period as a master template. He picked up his secure line and dialed a number he rarely used. It rang once before a voice answered. "Yes? Admiral Hollis, I need a favor. Run a name for me. Deep dive. Not just personnel records. Everything. Financials, travel, known associates. Everything from the day she was born. The name is Ilara Vance." There was a pause on the other end. "That's the woman in the news, sir. The phony SEAL. I know who she is. I want to know who she was. Something doesn't fit. Her lies are too accurate. Send it to my personal terminal." He hung up, his eyes still fixed on the medal. The murmur he had uttered in the interrogation room was meant to unnerve her, to show her that her game was up, but it had turned into a question he now needed answered for himself. Meanwhile, in the detention center, and Sarah Jenkins finally got her client to talk. It was a late-night visit, the visiting room almost empty. Ilara looked smaller, the uniform replaced by a plain gray jumpsuit. She seemed to have shed her skin along with her chief's uniform. "Ilara," Sarah said softly, pushing a cup of watery coffee towards her. The pretrial hearing is in 2 weeks. The DA is offering a deal. 5 years with possibility of parole in 3. If you take this to trial and lose, you're looking at 10, maybe 15. They want to make an example of you. Alara stared at the coffee, her fingers wrapped around the styrofoam cup. They can't make an example of something they don't understand. Then help me understand, Sarah pleaded. Where did you get the uniform, the knowledge, that medal? If I know, I can build a defense. Maybe it's a mental health issue, a delusional disorder. We can get you help, not prison. Ilara finally looked up, and for the first time, Sarah saw not the narcissistic con artist the media portrayed, but something else. A deep, profound weariness, and behind it a flicker of fear. A delusion, she repeated, her voice hollow. That's what everyone wants it to be. It's easier that way. A crazy woman playing soldier. Put her away. Problem solved. She shook her head slowly. The medal? I was told it would open doors, that it was the key. I just didn't know what doors. What doors? Told by who? Sarah pressed, her journalist's instinct sensing a shift in the bedrock of the case. Ilara closed her eyes. There are people who collect these things, Sarah, not collectors, curators, archivists of a secret history. They don't just want the stories, they want the proof. The artifacts. They find people like me, people who can move in certain circles, who can listen and remember. They send us in to gather the stories, the details, the unwritten lore. In exchange, they give us the tools to be believable. A perfect uniform, a flawless medal, a legend that can't be cracked by a simple database search. She opened her eyes, and they were clear and sharp. I wasn't lying for attention. I was working. I was a collector for the collectors, and now that I'm caught, they'll disappear, and I'll be left holding the only piece of evidence that matters. She pointed a finger at her own chest, where the medal had once been pinned. A ghost that only a general would recognize as real. Sarah Jenkins left the detention center that night with her head spinning. Her client, a woman she was preparing to defend as mentally ill, had just spun a story that sounded like the plot of a spy novel. A shadowy network of collectors, hoarding the authentic relics and secrets of special operations history, using field agents to gather intelligence and launder artifacts. It was preposterous. It was also, if even 1% true, the most dangerous defense strategy imaginable. Accusing a non-existent conspiracy would sink her credibility with the jury and guarantee her client a maximum sentence.